Welcome my dear Australopitheci. Today is Monday, we are starting a new week, and we're also diving in once again in balance tuning changes. However, unlike yesterday, these are not balance tuning for the near future in the next patch coming out in weeks. These are balance tuning changes coming out in a hotfix in just basically a day in NA and a couple of days in EU with the next reset. So the positive is that there is plenty of changes, so they are going to hit many of the specs. The negatives are that the changes are not that big. They are not that revolutionary, even though they are going to hit many specs. So let's immediately start with the first of the changes, which is also quite the controversial one, because it starts on a very good way, on a very nice theme, because Restoration Druid gets buffed. So the first buff is that Luxuriant Soil, the talent to spread your rejuvenation like AIDS, gets buffed. At rank 2, instead of a 2% chance, you have a 3% chance to spread rejuvenation. And the first impression to this is good. Then you have the second talent, Embrace the Dream. The extra healing next to your wild growth is increased by 25%. First impression is also good. Where we have the problem is the third buff, which is all healing increased by 5%. This is not good, because at the moment the first two buffs made sense, because this is the HPS in the raid so far, the average HPS of the healing specs, and it shows Rest of the Druid lagging a little bit behind. So the first two talents getting buffed are primarily used exclusively in the raid. So if you're buffing them, you're basically just buffing Rest of the Druid in the raid, which is where it looks like it's not nearly as strong. The second part, however, is buffing all of Druid. 5% more healing to all of Druid in any content. The problem of this is that currently Resto Druid is the most broth and the best at the moment healer in Mythic Plus. So buffing them by 5% in all of their healing is also going to buff them in Mythic Plus, where they seem like they are doing just fine at the moment. They definitely did not need this extra healing buff. So that is why we start with a pretty controversial one, as the first part of the buff is warranted for the raid, but the second part, going to hit also their already just fine Mythic Plus version, is not nearly as warranted. After Druid, we jump into Death Knight. There is only a tiny bit of a change in the general tree, so for all three specs. Soul Reaper damage is increased by 10%, and Icy Talons, your attack speed buff duration, is increased to 10 seconds instead of 6. Where we do see more changes is with Unholy Death Knight. So Unholy at the moment is lagging behind in the raid and not that popular in Mythic Plus, but then again it is still tangled in this massive ball of specs at the moment that we have, sort of wrestling in the middle, wrestling in the averageness of the specs. These buffs might help them climb a little bit higher, away from this tangle in the middle. Apocalypse Ghoul duration is now 20 seconds long instead of 15. Death Coil damage, Clawing Shadows, and Scorch Strikes damage all have been increased by 10%. And then 6% for both of your basic spenders. Plague Winger duration is increased to 10 seconds instead of 5, and Reaping, your execute damage buff basically, goes from 20 to 25%. So these are the buffs to Unholy. They are decent enough. Again, as I said, nothing major, nothing groundbreaking in terms of buffs for the specs, but it's definitely good, and it's also definitely one of the specs which needed some more love when it comes to tuning. We then have some tiny changes once again, but worth mentioning because they are not that irrelevant. One is to Evoker. Evoker is being buffed. Evoker disintegrate damage is buffed by 15%. Also, Evoker was in a similar situation as where Unholy was, albeit perhaps a bit more popular in Mythic Plus. They still had this problem though. Their single target damage, especially their single target spender disintegrate, hit like a wet noodle. The only time you felt you were doing damage was because you were proccing your talent, also casting Eternity Surge when you were casting Disintegrate. Otherwise, if your talent did not proc, Disintegrate felt very, very disappointing. So this buff is going to help a little bit. It's also going to help, incidentally, Preservation Evoker do more single target damage, because this buff is also going to be applied to the healer version of Evoker. Talking about tiny little bit of changes, we have a back and forth and back for Marksmanship Hunter. Marksmanship was buffed in all of their damage by 10%, and some more damage buff to their AoE, to their trick shots, ricochet, AoE damage. Now that 10% buff is scaled back a little bit because Marksmanship Hunter gets all ability damage reduced by 3%. This was definitely also warranted, considering that Marksmanship was doing noodle damage before. Marksmanship was considered quite low in priority, and after that set of buffs became much more powerful, became much more prevalent in Mythic Plus keys, and also it's currently towards the top of the performance in the raid as well. So that's perhaps a little bit too much of a growth in just a few days because of a single buff given to Blizzard, so they are reining them back in a little bit more. Then we have the worst part of the video. As I said before, some of you guys might not believe me, you might call me a conspiracy theorist, you might tell me to pull off my tinfoil hat at the moment, but as I said, Blizzard is contractually obligated to keep buffing Fire Mage at least once a month until it becomes meta. That is the contract, the legally binding contract that Blizzard is currently in. So that's what happens. Fire Mage gets buffed. Yes, we are still being honest, Fire Mage is terrible right now, it's just awful. The way the new talents have made the hard casting of Pyroblast the best way to play, at the same time has made Fire Mage also much more clunky to play, and on top of that the damage isn't even good. So Fire Mage is getting sweeping buffs across the board, once again to their 4 basically baseline abilities, so Fireball, Pyro, Scorch, and Fire Blast, but also to Ignite as well. 12% to the abilities and 5% to Ignite. This should actually bump up Fire from being the absolute worst to being, at the very least, in the bottom pack, which is an improvement. We will see in a couple of weeks, once Blizzard decides to buff Fire Mage once again. After Fire, you also have Frost Mage being buffed. Frost Mage is in a similar situation as Fire Mage, not nearly as good, and perhaps not that bad, but just overshadowed a little bit more by Arcane, especially in the raid. In Mythic Plus, they get to be kind of more on a closer gap, but still not doing too hot at the moment. No pun intended, even if they're Frost Mages. Buffs go to Ice Lance, 12% more damage, and then Flurry, Frostbolt, and Glacial Spike all buffed by 15%, which is a significant buff for Frost Mages. Also, Splitting Ice now causes Icicles and Ice Lance to hit an additional target for 80% of the damage instead of 65% of the damage. So even more cleave AoE damage given to Frost Mage. Again, jokes aside about Fire, both of the specs were in need of a buff at the moment. After Mage, we have Monk. Windwalker receives a similar treatment to what Marksmanship received, and Windwalker is also just about the same in terms of performance as Marksmanship. So 3% damage nerf going on to Windwalker as well. I still think they should have perhaps focused the actual problems of Windwalker in their AoE heavier side of problems rather than the single target, but this nerf is still fine in trying at the very least to rein in the power of Windwalker at the moment. After this we have, of course, could it be missing? Could we be missing a bunch of Shadow Priest changes in a balance tuning video? No, of course Shadow Priest is a drama whore, it's an attention-seeking slut, so of course he gets the spotlight once again in the balance tuning. A whole bunch of abilities once again buffed across the board for Shadow between 10 to 20%, especially Void Bolt, Mind Blast, Mind Spike, and Mind Flay, all buffed by 20% more damage. Once again, also, the current situation of Shadow in the raid in terms of performance wasn't very good, and in Mythic Plus, in their AoE, where perhaps they are doing a little bit better, is probably the reason why their AoE talent isn't actually being touched in here, isn't actually being buffed, it's just mostly single target and dot abilities instead, so this is also a warranted buff to Shadow Priest. We then have some changes to Rogues. Now, Rogues were in a situation very similar to mid Shadowlands. Right after Assassination and Subtlety were both buffed significantly, and we found ourselves looking at Sanctum logs and the situation in Sanctum and very often seeing 3 rogues at the top. This is basically what we are seeing currently. All 3 rogue specs are performing very well at the moment. So Assassination, Outlaw, and Subtlety, damage reduced by 3% across the board. sweeping nerf to all 3 specs. The extra nerf to Assassination is that Fatal Concoction's damage bonus goes from 15 to 10%, and to all 3 specs, Resounding Clarity now causes Echoing Reprimand to Anima Charge 2 additional combo points instead of 3. This is not as relevant for Subtlety and Outlaw because they don't typically take Echoing Reprimand, especially in the raid. It's much more relevant as a nerf to Assassination, since they do take Echoing Reprimand and Resounding Clarity as talents in the general tree of Rogue. So Assassination gets basically 3 different nerfs, while Outlaw and Sub just get a couple, essentially. After this we have Shaman. Shaman, we have Enhancement as the only spec being mentioned in this immediate tuning, which is Enhancement. Enhancement gets the Marksmanship treatment, who got the Windwalker treatment, who got the Rogues treatment, which is damage done reduced by 3%. Enhancement was the last of the specs with a gap above the rest at the top. We have the 3 Rogue specs, Windwalker, Marksmanship and Enhancement, and now all of these specs have just gotten nerfed by roughly 3%, Assassination a bit more, but they are all getting touched by nerfs right now. Meanwhile, we were also talking about the specs at the bottom. We mentioned Frost and Fire and Shadow Priest being at the bottom, all getting buffed. Who is the other spec at the bottom? It's Affliction. Affliction also is at the bottom together with these other 3 recently buffed specs, and Affliction also gets buffed as well. Malefic Rapture damage is increased by 15%, Drain Soul and Shadow Bolt by 20%, and Pandemic Invocation damage, the refreshing of your dots doing damage instantly for a bit of spell damage, is increased by 500%, which is massive, right? It looks like a gigantic number. It's because the damage itself is shit. So even if you buff it by this much, it's not going to be a massive change. Still, we have more buffs to one of the other. We can say to the bottom 4 underperforming specs, at the very least when it comes to the raid. For example, Affliction is also getting buffed. To be fair, there is another spec not doing too well when it comes to Warlock, which is Destruction. Destruction gets buffed, but with a much smaller amount of text. Destruction simply gets 5% more damage to their Chaos Bolt. I always like to say that it's always a very dangerous type of buff to be buffing Destruction damage in their Chaos Bolt damage, because of how Destruction tends to scale out of control, and eventually those buffs to Chaos Bolt are going to come back and bite the balance tuning in the ass. But at the moment, Destruction is so far behind in terms of stats, in terms of what they would need to get rolling, that this buff is probably still not going to do too much, at the very least at the moment. We will see. Destro, we will see each other again in about 50 item levels to see how you're changing. Lastly, we have changes to Warrior, and the 2 specs of Warrior being buffed are just the 2 DPS specs. So, Fury. Surprisingly, they receive a buff, even though Fury is doing just fine. As we mentioned, the top 6 specs in terms of performance in the raid, Fury was the 7th one. Fury was the one right below, before there was a little bit of a gap for the top 6. So don't get surprised. The reason why Fury gets buffed is because they had a pathetic, literally ridiculously hilarious damage bonus from their tier set. It was meaningless. It was very, very tiny, something like 0.5% more damage or 1% more damage, when many of the other DPS specs were gaining 4, 5 or 6% more damage. So that's where the buff goes to Fury. Execute critical hit chance bonus increased to 25% instead of 10%. So it was a warranted buff given the terrible state of their tier set. That's why they're getting buffed, even though they're doing quite well already. Then we have Arms. Arms, of course, was doing quite bad. Arms closes the circle. Arms closes the circle of the worst performing specs in the raid. We went through the 2 mage specs at the bottom, we went to Shadow Priest, we went through Affliction, so now Arms comes and joins them. All ability damage increased by 3% for Arms, but they also get some extra. Multi-strike damage, their key damaging ability, is increased by 5%, and execute damage is increased by 10%. So these are the changes to yet another one of the underperforming specs. So at the end of the tuning, we can see that Blizzard, for the most part, went to pick at the top and at the bottom. They somewhat left all of the specs in the middle alone. You know, specs like Arcane Mage, Feral Druid, Balanced Druid, Survival Hunter, Devastation Evoker, Elemental Shaman, Havoc Demon Hunter, all sort of muddled in the middle, are being left alone. Now, this of course has spawned a few questions from players after seeing these changes, which is that is Blizzard really caring at all about the Mythic Plus? Because many of these changes, as Izen has been talking about, seemed pretty focused about raiding, seems pretty focused about the performance in the raid, and much less about the performance in Mythic Plus, as seen by certain buffs, for example, to Restoration Druid, who already is the best performer in Mythic Plus, still getting buffed because it's not doing nearly as well in the raid, for example. That seems to be the case at the moment. It seems to have a heavier focus on the performances from the raid rather than trying to keep the Mythic Plus season balanced. But as I said, the buffs and the nerfs were tiny enough that likely they weren't going to change the entire meta of Mythic Plus, while perhaps they might still be enough to help some of these specs in performing better in the raid as a result. So I'm hoping that all of the specs getting nerfed are going to not dominate nearly as much, and I'm hoping that all of the specs getting buffed are going to become a little bit more viable in next week's reset. All, of course, except Fire Mage, who still needs to stay in a ditch for their crimes. Now, with this being said and done, out of this Monday, we have nothing else to point out for today. So, thanks, of course, as usual, to all of my Patreon supporters for supporting and contributing to the growth of this channel. You can still support in other ways, completely free, as usual. Liking and commenting down below and subscribing to the channel itself are perfectly fine ways to show your support. I am also found on Twitter, if you want to follow me there to check, for example, whenever I'm going live on my stream over at Twitch. You can also support me by subscribing to my Patreon to get access to my Discord server. And lastly, of course, I am going live nowadays on Twitch, streaming 10 p.m. European time zones, 1 p.m. Pacific, and 4 p.m. Eastern US time zones. So, with this out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I think it's time to get out of this plaster. It's been on for like 3 days, and I think the cat now has healed at this point, right? Surely.